That mailbox is a code violation, and so is the man who built it. Take it down by Friday, or we start fining you $50 a day. That was Brenda Ostrander, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, standing at the end of my driveway in a coral blazer and white sneakers that had never touched a job site. The mailbox she wanted gone was a length of welded pipe my wife and I had set in concrete the summer before Diane got sick. What Brenda did not know, what she never once bothered to check in the 6 years she fined me, was that I had spent 31 years as a telecommunications field engineer, and that the easement her whole association depended on ran straight through a contract with my name on the witness line. If you got a letter like that taped to your gate with a number on it and a deadline, what would you have done? My name is Walter Henley. I am 63 years old. I spent my working life climbing poles and pulling fiber across 3 counties for the regional phone cooperative. And when I retired, I bought 4 acres at the edge of Cedar Ridge because the lot backed up against national forest and nobody could build behind me. Diane picked the spot. She stood in the cleared dirt with her hands on her hips and said, "This is where the porch goes," and that is where the porch went. She passed 2 springs after we moved in. The mailbox was the last thing we poured together, and I was not going to take it down because a woman in a coral blazer told me a man who built it was a violation. I should explain what 31 years of that work does to a man, because it is the whole reason this story has the ending it has. You do not climb a pole on faith. You climb it on the load chart, the strain calculation, the ticket that says the line is dead before you touch it. A careless lineman is a dead lineman. And the men who lasted were the men who checked the paper twice and the ground once, and never trusted a thing they had not verified with their own hands. I carried that off the pole and into the rest of my life. I read contracts the way other men read the sports page. I kept receipts in a shoebox sorted by year. When Diane wanted to know why I would not just sign the closing documents and trust the realtor, I told her the realtor was not going to be the one living on the wrong side of a survey line for the next 20 years. She understood. She was the same way about her recipes, exact to the quarter teaspoon. And we got along on that account for 38 years. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I am not a dramatic man. I kept my temper the way I kept my tools, oiled and put away where I could find it. When Brenda handed me that first notice, I did not argue. I said, "Good morning." I took the paper, and I went inside and started a folder. A plain manila folder with a date written in the corner. I wrote the date because that is what you do with an after-action report. And I had been writing after-action reports on storm restorations for 3 decades. And an HOA notice was, to my eye, a small storm with a return address. By the end of this story, that folder was 3 inches thick, and every sheet in it was a step she took toward a cliff she could not see. Cedar Ridge was not much of an association when I moved in. 41 houses on a ridge road, a retention pond, a sign at the entrance with a fake lighthouse on it that made no sense because we were 900 miles from any ocean. The covenants ran to 11 pages, and I read all 11 the week I closed because reading the fine print was the only thing my father ever told me that I never once regretted following. My father ran a feed store for 40 years, and he told me once, leaning on the counter with a pencil behind his ear, that more men have been ruined by a paragraph they did not read than by any bank or any drought. I was 12. I did not understand it. I understood it by 60. Page 7 was the part that mattered, though I did not know it yet. Page 7 said the association maintained an access and utility easement across the rear quarter of the original tract, granted in 1978. And that all utility infrastructure within that easement remained subject to the terms of the original grant. I read that sentence the week I closed and thought nothing of it. the way you walk past the one tool on the wall you will need most 10 years later. I lived next to my daughter, in a way. My daughter Cassie was 19 and going to the community college in town. And she still kept her old room at my place for the nights the dorm felt too loud. She is the one who started filming. The third time Brenda came up the driveway, Cassie stood in the doorway with her phone held low and steady, and she did not say a word. She just recorded. Afterward, she came out onto the gravel where I was still holding the new notice, and she said, "Dad, you should keep those. Not the paper, the videos. People lie about what they said. They do not lie as easy about what the camera saw." She was 19 and she already understood something it had taken me half a career to learn, which is that the record is the only witness that does not get tired and does not get scared and does not change its story at the hearing. I told her later that was the smartest thing anybody in our family had done in a decade, and she rolled her eyes, but she kept doing it. She made a folder on her laptop and named it with a date and a word I will not repeat here. And every clip went into it, backed up to a drive she kept in her glove box, because her grandfather kept receipts in a shoebox, and the habit had skipped a generation and landed clean on her. The first year, the fines came slow. A notice about the mailbox. A notice about the color of my shed, which had been that color since before the association existed. A notice that my truck was parked in my own gravel in a manner inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. I did not pay them. I wrote one letter, polite, citing the page and paragraph that said, "The board could not levy architectural fines on structures predating the covenant," and I filed my copy. Brenda did not answer the letter. She answered with another fine. The shed notice is the one I remember best, because it was the first time I heard her say the things she would keep saying. She came up the drive on a Saturday in a white blazer this time, with Doug a step behind her, and she stood looking at my shed the way a building inspector looks at a condemned house. Though my shed had a new roof I had laid myself, and was sounder than half the houses on the ridge. "Mr. Henley, that shade of barn red is not on the approved palette. The community has standards. This is functionally part of our jurisdiction, and we cannot have one property setting a tone for the rest. It's the same red it was when I bought it. The covenant came after the shed. You can't fine a building for being older than your rules. That is your interpretation. The board interprets the covenants, not the homeowner." I remember thinking, standing there, that she had just told me out loud that her opinion was the law, and the paper was a formality. I did not say so. I said, "Have a good morning," and I wrote it down. The phrase "functionally part of our jurisdiction" went into the folder in quotation marks, because a phrase a person repeats is a phrase a person believes. And a belief is a thing you can hold up to a document later and watch shatter. That was the pattern, and I want you to hear how it built, because the building is the whole thing. By the end of the first year, there were 4 notices in the folder. By the end of the second, 11. She brought a man with her sometimes, a soft, heavy fellow named Doug Pruitt, who carried a clipboard and a tape measure and wore a polo shirt with the association's lighthouse stitched on the chest. He called himself the compliance inspector. He had no license, no certification, no authority beyond the polo. I asked him once, mildly, what body had certified him as an inspector, and he looked at me like I had asked him to recite the alphabet backward. And he said the board had appointed him, as if the board could appoint a man to the moon. He measured my fence one Tuesday and wrote me up because it stood 6 feet 2 inches, and the standard was 6 feet. And I wrote in the folder that the fence had stood since 1991, and the standard had been adopted in 2009. Doug measured to the 1/8 of an inch on a fence that predated his standard by 18 years, and never once thought to ask which came first. That was the whole association in one man with a tape measure. Precise about the wrong thing, and curious about the only thing that mattered. I should tell you about the husband, because the husband is where the story turns from petty to profitable. Brenda was married to a man named Gary Ostrander, and Gary ran a development company 2 towns over that I had never heard of and had no reason to hear of, until the spring of the 3rd year. When surveyors I did not hire started walking the tree line behind my property with orange flags and a total station on a tripod, I know surveying equipment. I spent 3 decades working alongside men who shot grades and set hubs. I watched these 2 from my porch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. And I understood, slowly, that the rear easement was not about access at all. I want to slow down on that morning, because it was the morning the whole shape of it came clear to me. And it came clear the way the sun comes over a ridge, all at once, after a long gray nothing. There were 2 of them, a young man on the instrument and an older one walking the line with the rod and the flags. They were sloppy, the way men are sloppy when they think the property is already theirs and everything but signature. They walked across my rear quarter without a by your leave. The older one set a flag not 40 feet from where Diane and I had once talked about putting a greenhouse, and I watched him sight back along the line he was flagging. And I followed that line with my own eyes. And I saw it run dead straight from the county strip behind the forest, across my back slope, to the ridge road out front. That is not a utility line. A utility line goes where the equipment is. That was a road. A man does not flag a center line and shoot grade unless he intends to pour something on it. I had shot enough grade in my life to know the difference between a man maintaining a corridor and a man building one. And these men were building. I set my coffee down on the rail, and I did not pick it up again until it was cold. And Biscuit came and leaned against my leg in the way a dog does when he can feel the air change around a man. A road through the rear easement would open the whole back slope to development. The national forest I thought protected me sat behind a strip of county land, and that strip could be reached only one way, across the old utility easement that crossed my rear quarter. If Gary Ostrander could establish that the easement was broad enough to carry a paved road, he could subdivide 40 acres of slope into building lots and run his access right behind my porch. The fines were never about my mailbox. The fines were about making me sell or making me tired, or building a paper record that I was a non-compliant owner the board could eventually move against. I wrote that on a fresh sheet and underlined it twice. Year 3, notice number 19. Now here is where a calm man has to be careful, because the temptation is to go down to the clubhouse and say all of this out loud. I did not. I knew something they did not, and the value of a thing you know is cut in half the moment you announce it. So I kept filing. I requested, in writing, a copy of the original 1978 easement grant from the county recorder, and I paid the $4 and waited 11 days for it to come in the mail. The clerk at the recorder's office was a patient woman named Lottie, who had been pulling instruments for the county since before the association existed. And when I told her the book and page, I was after she nodded like I had ordered a sensible lunch. And she told me most folks never come in until they are already being sued. And I told her I intended to be the exception. And she said good for you in a way that meant she had watched a lot of people learn the hard way. When it came, I read it 3 times at the kitchen table while Cassie did her homework across from me. And on the 3rd read, I started to laugh, quietly, the way you laugh when a thing you half remembered turns out to be exactly true. Cassie looked up from her chemistry and asked what was funny, and I slid the page across to her and said, "Read who it was granted to." She read it. She looked at me. She said, "That is not the HOA." I said, "No, it is not." She said, "Do they know that?" I said, I am fairly certain they have never looked. And she sat back in her chair with the particular delight of a 19-year-old who has just watched the adults turn out to be exactly as careless as she suspected. The easement was granted to the Regional Telephone Cooperative, not to the Homeowners Association, which did not exist in 1978. The association had been formed in 1986 and had simply assumed in its covenants that it controlled an easement it had never been party to. The grant was specific. It permitted buried and aerial telecommunications infrastructure and the maintenance thereof, and it permitted vehicular access solely for the servicing of that infrastructure. It did not permit a road. It did not permit subdivision access. And the cooperative that held the easement, the actual legal holder of the rights Gary Ostrander needed, was the company I had given 31 years of my life to. I knew the people who ran it. I knew the man who had taken my old job coordinating outside plant for the whole region, a younger fellow named Marcus Bell, who I had trained myself, back when he could not splice a ribbon cable without help. I knew that the cooperative guarded its easements the way a dog guards a bone, because every easement was a place it had the right to put equipment. And rights of way were the only thing a phone company owned that nobody could manufacture more of. I knew that if Gary Ostrander wanted to run a road through that easement, he needed the cooperative's written consent. And I knew, with the certainty of a man who had sat in those meetings, that the cooperative would never grant it casually, and never at all to someone who had not asked. I did not call Marcus. Not yet. I had learned, climbing poles for 31 years, that you do not key the radio until you are sure of what you are going to say, and you do not deploy the one fact that ends the argument until the other side has committed so fully to being wrong that they cannot climb back down. So I waited, and I filed. And I let Brenda build her staircase. Year 4 was the worst of it, and it is the year I have to tell carefully, because it is the year she started reaching past me toward the people around me. I did a little side work in retirement, helping neighbors with their own lines and their own poorly run cable drops, cash jobs, nothing big. A man does not climb poles for 31 years and then watch his neighbors get gouged by a service tech who cannot find the demarcation box. Brenda found out. She started calling the people I worked for and telling them I was operating an unlicensed business in a residential community in violation of the covenants, and that they could be fined for contracting with me. One of them was an old rancher named Earl Dempsey, who had been on that ridge longer than the association had existed. Earl called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear in his voice that he was embarrassed. Walt, that Ostrander woman, called me. Said I'd get a letter if I had you back out to fix my dish. You won't get a letter, Earl. She can't fine you for who you hire. She sounded real sure. She always does. Keep the voicemail if you've got it. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause an old man takes when he's deciding whether to say the next thing. Then Earl said, Walt, she said you were the kind of man who lets a place go to seed, and that the board was going to handle you one way or another. He did not want to repeat it. I could tell. He was a fence-line neighbor of 40 years, and he did not want to carry a woman's ugliness up my driveway in his mouth. I thanked him for telling me. I told him it helped more than he knew, and it did. Because handle you one way or another is the sentence of a person who has decided the rules are a tool and not a limit. And a sentence like that, kept on a voicemail, is worth more than any fine notice she ever taped to my gate. He had it. He played it into my answering machine the next day so I would have a copy, and I transferred it to the folder, which by then was not really a folder anymore, but a banker's box with the manila folder living inside it. Year 4, Incident 26. A board member calling a private citizen to threaten him over a contractor. I did not know yet exactly what law that broke. But I knew it broke something. And I knew that a man who keeps the record does not need to know the statute the day it happens. He only needs to keep the record until the day someone who does know the statute reads it. The deputy came in year 4, too. His name was Ray Foster, a sheriff's deputy, maybe 40 years old. And he came up my driveway one afternoon because Brenda had filed a complaint that I was harassing the board. I met him at the gate with my hands where he could see them and my voice level, because I have always believed a uniform deserves a calm man in front of it. Ray looked tired before I said anything. He had the look of a man who had been sent up a mountain to handle something that should never have left the clubhouse. "Mr. Henley, I've got a complaint here that you've been sending threatening communications to the Homeowners Association. I've been sending them letters, Deputy, citing the covenants. You're welcome to read every one. I keep copies." He read 3 of them right there at the gate, standing in the gravel, and Biscuit sat down next to his boot and leaned, the way that dog decided in about 4 seconds who was safe and who was not. Ray scratched the dog's ear without looking down, still reading. When he handed the letters back, his face had changed. He told me plainly that a complaint had to be logged and that he had no choice but to take it. That the county did not get to decide which complaints were silly before they wrote them up, but that nothing he was looking at rose to anything criminal, and that if I kept doing exactly what I was doing, keeping copies, staying calm, he would not be the one to trouble me. Then he said something I wrote down word for word that night. "If they ever cross a real line, you'll want a pattern already built. Looks to me like you've got one. Keep building it." He got back in his cruiser, and he did not hurry. And before he pulled out, he rolled the window down and said one more thing, almost to himself, that the same address had generated more board complaints than the rest of the ridge put together, and that, in his experience, the house that gets complained about the most is usually the house that is doing the least wrong. Then he left. That was the countdown, though it did not feel like one yet. A neutral man in a uniform had just told me that the box of paper in my hallway was a case waiting for its final piece. I thanked him. I filed his visit. Year 4, Incident 29. The fines, by the way, kept climbing the whole time. Brenda had never collected a dime of them, because I never paid, and the covenants required arbitration before the board could place a lien. And she had never once filed for arbitration, because arbitration would have meant a neutral party reading page 7. By the end of year 4, the association's ledger showed I owed $11,200 in accumulated fines and daily penalties. $11,200, and not one of those dollars was collectible, and every one of them was a sentence in the confession she was writing without knowing it. Year 5 is when Gary stopped being a rumor. The development company filed a preliminary plat with the county for something called Cedar Ridge Estates, Phase 2. 41 proposed lots on the back slope, and the access drawing in that plat showed a paved road. The road ran exactly where I knew it would run, across the rear quarter of my tract, along the line of the 1978 easement. I got the plat the way I got everything, by requesting it from the county and paying the copy fee. And Lottie at the recorder's window slid it across to me and said, "That is your back 40 they have drawn a road on, Mr. Henley. Did you know?" And I told her I had been expecting it for 2 years, and she gave me a long look and said, "Then I expect you are ready." And I told her I had been ready since 1994 and just had not known the date. I sat with that plat a long time at the kitchen table. The road on that drawing was the proof of everything I had written in the folder. The mailbox, the shed, the fence, the calls to Earl, all of it, 6 years of it, had been clearing brush for that road. Brenda had not been finding a man over a paint color. She had been softening up the one parcel that stood between her husband and 40 acres of buildable slope. And she had done it for 6 years, without ever once verifying that the road she was clearing the way for could legally exist. Cassie looked at the drawing over my shoulder and traced the road line with her finger to where it crossed our property and said, "That goes right behind Mom's porch." And I said, "Yes, it does." And she said, "They are not going to build it, are they?" And I said, "No, sweetheart, they are not." That was the most I let myself say out loud before the hearing. I folded the plat into the box, and I went to bed, and I slept. Which surprised me, because a man sleeps well the night he finally knows the date of a thing he has been waiting 6 years to end. I want to be fair to Brenda Ostrander, because the rules of telling a true story require it. I do not think she sat in her kitchen plotting like a cartoon. I think she believed, the way some people come to believe, that her title was the same thing as her right, and that wanting the ridge to be a certain way was the same thing as having the authority to make it so. She had been president for 9 years, 9 years of people deferring to her over paint colors and fence heights. And somewhere in those 9 years, she stopped checking whether she was allowed to do a thing before she did it. That is the whole failure, and it is a quiet one. She never read page 7. She never pulled the easement. She never once, in 6 years, verified the thing her entire scheme depended on. The plat hearing was set for a Tuesday morning at the county planning office, and I marked it on my calendar. And then I did the thing I had been saving for 6 years. I called Marcus Bell. I want to slow down here because this is the call the whole story is named for, and it was the quietest thing imaginable. No shouting, no threats. I sat on my own porch on a Monday evening, the evening before the hearing, with the easement grant and the plat on the table in front of me and Cassie's dog, a black and tan mutt named Biscuit, asleep against my boot. I dialed a number I had known for 20 years. Marcus picked up on the second ring and was glad to hear from me, and we talked about nothing for a minute, the way men who train together talk, about his kids and my knees, and a storm route we had both worked in 98. And then I told him what I had. I told him there was a developer about to stand up in front of the county and represent that he had access across a cooperative easement. I told him the easement was the 1978 grant on the back slope of Cedar Ridge, the one that carried the old buried trunk line. I told him I had witnessed the maintenance agreement on that corridor myself in 94, and that he could pull it in 5 minutes because I knew exactly which cabinet it lived in. I told him nobody had asked the cooperative for anything. There was a silence on the line. The particular silence of a man whose whole job is rights of way, realizing somebody is about to drive a road across one of his without permission. And then Marcus said the thing I had known he would say since the day the orange flags appeared in my tree line. "Walt, nobody's contacted us about that corridor. If they're claiming access across our easement without consent, that's a problem for them, not us. I'll have our right-of-way counsel at that hearing tomorrow." That was the call. 11 words of real substance in it, maybe, and it ended a 6-year war. I did not raise my voice once. I did not say a single thing about Brenda Ostrander or her blazers or the $11,200. I did not need to. I had spent 6 years making sure that when this call came, it would be short, because the long part, the proof, was already sitting in a banker's box in my hallway. And the only thing left to do was hand the right fact to the one man in the state who could not ignore it. I hung up, and I sat on the porch until the light was gone, and Biscuit never woke up. And somewhere 2 towns over a young right-of-way lawyer was being told to clear her morning. The hearing was in a beige room with folding chairs and a long table where 3 planning commissioners sat. Brenda was there in a fresh blazer, this one a hard magenta, sitting beside Gary, who I had never actually met, and who turned out to be a tall man with a salesman's tan and a folder of glossy renderings. Doug Pruitt was there in his lighthouse polo. Earl Dempsey came and sat in the back next to Cassie, who had her phone out and low and steady the way she always did. And in the second row, in a gray suit, sat a woman I did not know, with a leather portfolio on her knees and a calm that I recognized because it was the same calm I had been practicing for 6 years. That was the cooperative's right-of-way counsel. Marcus had been as good as his word. Gary presented first. He was smooth. He talked about responsible growth and improved access and the natural extension of the existing community. And he put up a rendering of the road, and he said the access was secured by way of the existing easement across the rear of the Henley parcel. He said my name like it was a formality. Brenda nodded along beside him with the satisfaction of a woman watching a plan she had spent 6 years greasing finally roll downhill. Then the chair asked if anyone wished to speak, and the woman in the gray suit stood up before I could. And she introduced herself as counsel for the Regional Telephone Cooperative. And she laid one document on the table in front of the commissioners, and the room changed temperature. She did not raise her voice either. She said the easement referenced in the applicant's plat was a 1978 grant held by the cooperative, that its terms were limited to telecommunications, infrastructure, and servicing access, that it conveyed no right of vehicular roadway or subdivision access to any party, that the cooperative had received no application for consent and would not be granting one, and that any representation to this body that access had been secured was false. She slid the grant across the table. The chair read it. Then he read it again. He took his glasses off and set them on the page and looked up the length of the table at Gary Ostrander. And the silence in that beige room went on long enough that I heard the clock on the back wall. And I heard Cassie's phone not making a sound because she had it steady. And I heard Brenda shift in her folding chair. And nobody said one word for what felt like a full minute and was probably 10 seconds, which is the longest 10 seconds a confident person ever sits through. Gary's tan did not change, but his mouth did. He started to say that the easement was understood to be controlled by the association, and the chair asked him, simply, whether he had a written consent from the easement holder. And Gary did not have one, because there was no such thing, because the holder was a phone cooperative that nobody had thought to ask. The chair looked at Brenda then, because the plat application listed the association as a co-applicant, and he asked her the same question, and Brenda Ostrander, president of 9 years, opened her mouth in that room and found she had nothing in it. She looked at Gary. Gary looked at his glossy renderings. The renderings did not help anyone. I had one thing to add, and I had waited 6 years to add it. And when the chair turned to me, I did not make a speech. I laid the banker's box on the table. I said that I was the owner of the parcel the proposed road crossed, that I had served 31 years with the cooperative that held the easement, that I had witnessed the maintenance agreement on that very corridor in 1994, and that I had documented every contact from the association for 6 years, including the part where they had levied $11,200 in fines they never had authority to collect and never once filed for arbitration to enforce. I opened the box so they could see it was full. Then I closed it and sat down. The deed and the grant said everything I would have wanted to say, and they said it without my help. Here are the 2 numbers I want you to hold next to each other, because the gap between them is the whole story. $11,200 in fines the association recorded against me over 6 years, every dollar uncollectible. And 1 easement, recorded in 1978, 48 years before that hearing, that voided their entire road in a single sentence. 6 years of paper on her side. 48 years of paper on mine. She had been fighting a document that was older than the association itself and had never once gone to the courthouse to look at it. The plat was denied that morning, without prejudice, which is the planning board's polite way of saying come back when you have the rights you claim to have, knowing full well he never would. Cedar Ridge Estates. Phase 2 was finished before lunch. The consequences did not stop at the hearing room door, and they fell, every one of them, on the people who built the staircase. The Cooperatives Council did not let the false representation go. A formal complaint went to the county about a developer who had certified secured access he did not possess, and the planning department referred it. And within a few months, Gary Ostrander's company was under review for the representations in 3 other plats, because a man who will claim an easement he never asked for tends to have done it before. Earl Dempsey's voicemail and my 6 years of records went to the state, and the Attorney General's office opened a file on the association's fine practices, because levying and recording penalties you have no authority to collect against owners you are simultaneously trying to dispossess turns out to be exactly the kind of thing a state likes to look at. Brenda Ostrander resigned the presidency before the next annual meeting. She did not resign gracefully. She sent a long letter to all 41 households about her years of service, and the households who had finally seen the box of paper did not answer it any more than she had ever answered mine. Doug Pruitt took off the lighthouse polo and was never seen in it again. The association adopted a new bylaw, proposed by Earl Dempsey of all people, requiring that any architectural fine be supported by a citation to the covenant and the date of the structure. Which is to say, they wrote into law the exact letter I had sent Brenda in the first year, the one she never answered. I did not get the fines reversed in a ceremony. There was no moment where someone handed me a check or an apology. What I got was quieter than that. I got the road off my back slope permanently, because an easement does not expire and a phone company does not forget. I got to keep the mailbox. To keep a? And I got a Saturday morning a few weeks later when Cassie came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat down next to me and said, "You knew the whole time, didn't you?" And I said I knew most of it. And she laughed and put her head on my shoulder, and Biscuit thumped his tail against the boards, and the back slope behind us stayed exactly the trees it had always been. That is where Diane's porch looks out. I sat there a long while that morning. The mailbox she helped me pour was still standing at the end of the drive, a little crooked, exactly where we put it, and nobody was ever going to make me take it down. So let me step out of the story and tell you plainly what it taught me, because that is the only reason worth telling it. If an association or a board or any clipboard authority starts fining you, do not pay and do not panic. Pull your deed, pull your covenants, and read every page, especially the page about easements, because the easement is almost always where the real money and the real power sit. Go to the county recorder and pay the few dollars to get the original grants in writing, and read who they were actually granted to, because authority assumed is not authority held. Keep a folder. Write the date in the corner. Save the voicemails. Stay calm and stay polite, because calm is not weakness. Calm is a man loading the truck slowly so nothing breaks. And when you finally know the one fact that ends the argument, do not shout it across a driveway. Hold it until it matters, and then make one quiet phone call to the person who can actually use it. If you have a story like this, an HOA or a board or an inspector who pushed a family that turned out to have the paperwork all along, put it in the comments. Because I read them, and so does everyone who has ever found a fine taped to their gate. Subscribe if you want more of these, the true ones, where the deed wins and the family keeps the land. Next time, I will tell you about the woman who was ordered to drain her own pond by an HOA that did not know the pond was a registered dam, and what happened the spring the rain came early. Until then, read your fine print and keep your folder. It is heavier than it looks.